of the anti-money laundering provisions as espoused in the various pieces of legislation and regulations globally. So, but of course, it also means that when they scrutinized us, they found us wanting. And we've known this for a while. I think the message has been there for a while. The discussion has been taking place for a while. Despite this reprieve that we are not on the blacklist, the reality is that the repercussions for this gray listing are many. And I speak from experience. Just a very practical example is when we raised a fund which was domiciled in Mauritius not so long ago. One of the international investors that wanted to commit capital to us was very clear that they would not make a commitment in Mauritius. At the time, Mauritius was gray listed. I think they've just been removed from the gray list sometime last year. So it does have serious practical repercussions in terms of, can we attract capital? And if we do, at what cost does it come? Because we're under much more scrutiny now than we were before, which also then means that the cost of driving investment into our economy is that much higher. This, of course, also comes at a time where our local currencies on the continent are depreciating significantly against the US dollar, which remains the primary currency of doing business globally. So this doesn't bode well for us. We also know that the global economy has been in recession for some time, or at best, we're experiencing very low growth rates. And we as Africa know that when the world, the West in particular, goes through such experiences, it does directly affect us because it means less trade between us and them, or perhaps it becomes more expensive for us to trade with them. And of course, as if this is not all enough, we then have what potentially could be a bank run in the US. And those who are old enough will remember that this feels almost like what we went through in 2008, where we started with bank runs with some of the major banks, which led ultimately to a global economic recession. We remain hopeful, though, that this is not as dire a situation as that. But just to give you an idea of how severe what has happened is with I think it was with SVB Bank, which is the Silicon Valley Bank. It is said that just in one day, they saw a withdrawal of deposits up to $42 billion in one day when they had a run on the bank. Now, when you compare this to 2008, where the daily, well, over a 10-day period, there was a $16 billion run. And that $16 billion run on the banks, which took place over a period of 10 days, ultimately led to a global recession and a global economic crisis. So if this run happened in one day with one bank, we do have cause for concern. But as I said, many amongst us are of the view that the fundamentals that have driven what is happening in the US should not affect us, at least immediately. We don't expect to see bank runs in South Africa and in most African countries, touch wood. And hopefully today we'll get a better sense of, how does this look juxtaposed to that situation in 2008, and should we be very worried? This is now outside of the gray listing. So today we've invited people who are very well versed with what this gray listing means for us, both today and also in the future. And we were quite intentional about making the topic mapping South Africa's recovery, because we are here. We cannot decry the fact that we are here. It's a fact that we are here. But let's look forward. Let's focus on how do we, together as a collective, because it's not a government problem, it's not a financial services sector problem, it's a broader economic problem that affects ultimately every South African. And therefore, as APSIP, we thought, let's bring together various constituencies, stakeholders, and let's have a conversation as South Africans and as Africans to say, how do we map our way outside of this? How do we make sure that we recover and we strengthen our economy and our sector in particular? So before we kick off, I do want to again welcome everybody and thank our panelists for making themselves available. It is a Friday afternoon, it's 1 o'clock, it's the whiskey o'clock, it's gin o'clock. So we appreciate the sacrifices that everybody has made to be here. With that said, I would like to introduce our esteemed guest, the Minister of Finance, Minister Enoch Godongwana. Minister, your office sent me a profile. I don't know you to like very long introductions, but I must respect what your PA said I should read out. So Mr. Godongwana was appointed as Minister of Finance of the Republic of South Africa on the 5th of August, 2021. So that marks almost 20 months in office. He reminded me very strongly recently that he has been a minister for this period of time. And as a key constituency, we have not engaged with him. So hopefully, Minister, today we are starting to make up for that. You are a very important APSIPA, firstly, and a very important stakeholder for us. He holds a master's degree in financial economics from the University of London and is a member of the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress since 1997. He's the current chairperson of the ANC Economic Transformation Subcommittee. Prior to his appointment as the Minister of Finance, he was the chairperson of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. Amongst others, he has also been appointed to the boards of the New Development Bank and Mondi PLC. He is the former CEO of the Financial Sector Charter Council, a job that I know he carried very well because we used to interact a lot with him during those days. And is also a member of the Policy Board for Financial Services and Regulation. He served in government as the Deputy Minister of Economic Development, Deputy Minister of Public Enterprise, Member of Parliament, Member of the Eastern Cape Provincial Legislature, and a member of the Executive Council in the Eastern Cape responsible for finance, economic affairs, environment, and tourism. I will not read the rest of it, Minister, just to summarize and say that he is a communist, he is a unionist at the core. So we should expect some statements that might appear contrary to the role of a finance minister because of that background. Thank you, Minister. Welcome.
Program Director, the President of APSIP, the CEO of Standard Bank South Africa, the CEO of Business Unit South Africa, distinguished guests. Indeed, when I was in the ANC, not in government, I had a better relationship with APSIP. I used to have interactions a great deal. When I became a Minister of Finance, APSIP boycotted me. And I complained to Puli about that. I said to Cass, given that he's here, I'll have to change the entire text. But let me remind you first and foremost, before talking about the subject matter, which I'm not an expert on it, by the way. It's just challenges in my life which I have got to respond to. My life has been characterized by interesting things. As I was about to join government, South Africa was downgraded by the 3 major rating agencies. And I told myself, thanks God they downgraded before I came, because nothing worse is going to come. The next thing, I delivered a budget speech last year on the 23rd of February. As I woke up, I went to an interview with the SABC at 7 a.m. So I go back to the office. And Dr. Peters, the DDG for Asset and Liability, says, Minister, your numbers have changed. I said, why? He said, Russia has attacked Ukraine. So the next thing is that I get another, all of these are shocks in my life, that we have got this peer review, which has been done by FATF, and now they've gravely listed us. So I said, oh, my life is not that easy as a Minister of Finance. And somebody was talking to me, And he said, would you want to be the minister? Would you want to be the CEO of ESCOM? I said, would you want to be the Minister of Finance of South Africa? Because it seems that's a more difficult task than being a CEO of ESCOM. So I want to raise those set by way of introduction that some of the challenges which influence the things one does. But I want to remind also on the 22nd of the 26th of October last year in the midterm budget policy statement, and again in February this year, I highlighted among others 3 things. You know, the people who call themselves the left make a lot of noise about macroeconomic policy and so on and so on. So nice things to say. But could you have any macroeconomic policy being effective in the absence of electricity? Absolutely no. I don't know, Mamilo, if you people have modeled the fact that if you look at any correlation between the outages from 2008 to now, and to what extent has that contributed to low growth? You would see in 2010, third quarter, we're beginning to pick up, but a number of other things, electricity being part, and also the state capture. I'm not a denialist. Can you see? But a nice guy. I'm not a denialist. A second set of issues was beginning to challenge Nastis logistic, in particular Transnet. Somebody says to me, you know, Transnet is probably the same level as ESCOM, but the problem you can't see Transnet is unlike ESCOM, because in ESCOM you see the lights go off. In Transnet it's not as visible as that, but it's massive. Now, the guys in the Chamber of Mines, when they come and scream and insult me, tell me some interesting numbers. The first number they told me was the last time we did over 50 million tons was in 1996. Since then, we've been above, in terms of coal, above 70 million tons. These are the numbers they throw to me. They said, then in 2021, we've gone back to the 1996 numbers. They also gave me a punch and said, by the way, as a result of that, you lost 27 billion rand in revenue. So logistics is becoming a challenge. Crime and corruption are a third component of that. Whether you look at it in the context of ESCOM, you look at it in the context of additional factors to ESCOM, additional factors to Transnet, additional factors to the construction industry. When people rock up and say, we demand 30%. A whole range of factors. When you shoot a tourist in Kruger National Park, Germany for that matter, all European newspapers is in front pages. What are the implications of that? Those tourists, 14 million of them, who used to go to Russia, who do not want to go to Russia at the moment, they will not choose us as a destination because we kill people. So across the stream, crime and corruption is a constraint to growth. It's not only about safety, well-being, it's also a constraint to growth. I'm raising these issues because some of them have got implications for the Greylist-Mapping. They've got implications for the Greylist-Mapping. So I'll come back to those issues. Let me do what a normal finance minister does. If you have not done that stuff, people think that you're not a proper finance minister. Say something about economy, right? And that economy depends on what happens at global. And we're all aware that we're witnessing a slow growth globally, which has got implications on us. And China's rebound is slow. High inflation, which leads to high interest rate impact on consumers. So global risks remain, which are likely to have an implication for us. I don't want to run them again, including food and energy prices. I'm not sure whether our friends in Russia and Ukraine are likely to settle their disputes soon. Let's hope they do. Let's hope they do. I mean, it's quite a fascinating thing. So, my first meeting after that conflict was in April in Bali, sitting with other ministers of G20. We fought. I must condemn Russia, condemn Russia. I said to them, oh, it's nice. I would like to condemn them, but the problem, all of you here, I'm afraid to go home because I'm going to meet people protesting for fuel prices. Whereas all of you, after this meeting, you'll be getting gas from Russia. What morality is that? So we ended up fighting, having what is called a chairperson statement. A chairperson statement. So we're within all of these issues. So even at home, for the first time in a long time, if there's ever been one, Lungisa, a disagreement between the National Treasury and SARS on growth. And that disagreement arises as to what assumptions are we making about the intensity of load shedding. SARB's, the Reserve Bank's assumption is more and more load shedding that is intense, and Treasury is kind of taking a moderate stance. And then they arrived at a different number. So load shedding it remains a major threat. Ports and rail remains a major threat. Widespread criminal activities remain that issue. So when FATF, that peer review, we did a lot. They had about 67 actions on our part. 67 actions on our part. But it was not surprising. If you read the Zondo report, it's actually a testimony to some of the findings. It's a testimony to those findings. Hey, my life is not that easy. Now you come in the context of that, you are telling me about bank probe challenges. You know what I mean? So, but one thing with banks in South Africa, they're in irritation because they're conservative. And that is also their strength, right? They're conservative, it's also their strength. And that makes them stable. Sometimes I get irritated, but I understand. You know what I mean? I'm saying if they were not that conservative, we'd probably see these spillovers to our banks. Even during the global financial crisis, we managed to survive our banks. I think what has been a challenge with our banks has been the small banks. If you look at the history, our problem has been the small banks. Even now, if you're talking about the small banks, hey, I get worried. And some people think that, I mean, in some of them, one time, even when I was dealing with Teba Bank, and people said, no, I'm dealing with Black Bank. Whereas I was not dealing with a Black Bank, I was just protecting the depositors. You see the difference? Easy for you, so you're looking at the ownership. My duty is to protect the depositors, irrespective of color. So what were the key findings of the FATF. I categorize, although there were 67, I categorize them into two. The first category relates to our regulatory framework, its weaknesses and loopholes. Now, we moved with speed in an unprecedented way and pushed through a general amendment law in an amazing way. We're even given an exemption from what is called socio-economic impact in order to make sure that we can meet the deadlines. Interesting, today we're talking about something and somebody says, no, guys, so we've got FATF, let's park everything. When we want to change these laws, is that a problem under FATF? So it's a positive development. Now it's giving us space to move with speed because we've got to meet the FATF targets. So we place all of these laws and another one which has got an abbreviation which I can't pronounce. Let me read the piece of legislation which we also piloted. I think the General Laws Amendment Act, which deals with anti-terrorism and money laundering. There's another one which we asked the Department of Police to push. It has got a long abbreviation. It is called the Protection of Constitutional Democracy Against Terrorist and Related Activities Amendment Act. Big piece of legislation. So with those two legislation, we closed the loophole on the regulatory framework. I went against this, I was telling people, Tina's politician, but figure about that, but I feel we're going to hide. With this new piece of legislation, don't hide anybody because it's going to be difficult to transfer the money. It's going to be difficult to transfer. I'm being honest. You know, I was warning even my people from my party. I said, hey guys, be careful. Including those black bags in our conferences. Hey, it's going to be difficult. Including those black bags in our conferences. This piece of legislation are going to be tough. So, what has also been the positive development about this thing? There was cooperation amongst all departments. We put up a formidable team. When we went to Morocco, we had 51 officials. No brigadier, oh brigadier, oh banman, everybody. It was a big delegation across the system, which was an effective one. But we managed to do 62 out of 67. Now, if I have a LAL, Funded Department of Basic Education, if I demand 99, if not 100%. In fact, to pass, you must have 100%. So we're left with only 5 outstanding matters. If I have a sticker or red. But I was telling somebody, I mean, yeah, grey listing is a problem, but you're worried cost of borrowing and so on. Yeah, it's part of that. You know, grey listing, I took it as an individual. You know, I'm a PEP. And I'm grey listed already as an individual. I'm a PEP. If I go to any bank, I go through what is called an enhanced scrutiny. A PEP. Standard Bank, it took how many months to do an enhanced due diligence on any man. If you buy anything about a farm, through ups and ups after a year. Can you remind us again, who gave you where did you get the money? So now put yourself that this kind of enhanced scrutiny of a PEP is the whole country as a whole now is a PEP. In terms of that arrangement, is going to go through an enhanced scrutiny. But I'm saying to you, we have done a lot by now. We've done a lot by now to deal with this issue. Because the 5 outstanding matters relate to the loopholes of implementation in the security cluster. It's not a legislative framework. Relate to loopholes in the implementation of the security cluster. Now, even banks will have to work with us quite careful on these issues. Let me give you an indication why Dlamini Yuga Banks has got to work with us. In March last year, Janet Yellen sent me 4 people. And he says to me, these people are in South Africa, 2 are in Durban, 2 are in Cape Town. They are funding terrorists. And they're intelligent. Do you know? But no, we've been following them. I knew they were lying. In October, Janet Yellen sent another 4, which is related to that group. I go back to them. They said, no, even these ones, we've been following them. Now, you may take that thing lightly, and you want me to persuade Janet Yellen to help me in the debate in FATF. How do I convince her when I've not proved that I can arrest people who are, in fact, according to the Americans, have been sanctioned by the Americans? They're in my country. They're in my country. So we've got to deal with the security cluster effectively in our country. You know, now we're under the spotlight of the United Nations because Rwanda for genocide. So all of those minor things you can see, they look minor, né? But in the international community, we become a country which is lacks on critical issues. Now, it's easy for a minister to complain. I'm not complaining. I'm telling you the challenge I'm facing, but what can I do from my side? You know? What can I do from my side? I've provided 1.3 billion rand to the NPA over the next medium term to deal precisely with the FATF issues and the Zondo Commission report. There it is. That's my intervention we can do. We're giving 265 million rand to the Financial Intelligence Center to deal with these issues. 985 million rand to the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation to strengthen its capacity and to employ another 2,647 posts. We've given the police 10,000 people in this fund and in this year, ending in March. In the years beginning from the 1st of April, they will employ another 5,000, which will add another, which will be 15,000 over the MTF. What are we trying to do with that? What we're trying to do with that is to make sure that we can strengthen the security cluster. I'm giving the program of action that are in compliance. How are we doing in order to get out of this thing as quickly as possible? So we've got to strengthen that cluster because most of our challenges arises out of that cluster. What have we done from our side? We've provided necessary resources. All of this combined total to 14 billion rand for that cluster. I've excluded the 7 billion rand, it's almost 8 billion rand for the police. All of that are efforts to make sure that we exit from grey listing as quickly as possible. In the G20, one of the, was it the G20 or just meeting? This guy from Mauritius come to me and says, no, we've been there. Here's my card. Come, I'll tell you how to exit quickly. We're not alone. I was in Saudi Arabia last week. They've been through this thing. Morocco has been through this thing, and Mauritius has been through this thing. It's one of the challenges. Nigeria is in it. They'll have a government from the 1st of May for now. After the elections, take time in Nigeria. So what else are we doing? We're changing the entire procurement processes. We'll be tabling end of this month a new procurement bill before Parliament. Now everybody has been attacking me. Hey, when are you going to place this thing before Parliament? Let me tell you the challenges of a democratic polity. We took the bill on the 6th of May to NEDLEC. 6th of May. We came out of NEDLEC on the 7th of October. Came out of NEDLEC on the 7th of October. It's a democratic process of consultation, but we've had public hearings, we've had all of these. When I came out of NEDLEC, I've got to get a certificate from the state law advisors that it meets whatever standards that required by the state law advisor. Guess what? Next, I've got to go for in the President's Department of Monitoring and Evaluation. They must give me a certificate that it meets another criteria, socioeconomic impact. But at last, I'm going to table it before Parliament after all of this process. It's also a contribution to this process of making sure that the procurement processes are transparent and meet the constitutional requirement and so on and so on. But you have got to to look at it with an eye carefully, because it must also meet not only those standards, it must also talk to the transformation issues. We must talk to the transformation issues. I lost a court case in the Constitutional Court this year, and everybody are blaming the judges, and the judges were correct. What Judge Madlanga said, oh, you were given powers by the Constitution. You, out of your own choice, you decided to narrow your powers in the PPPFA. We can't come around and say you'll use a secondary legislation to change the law. Take a hike. You have got the powers to change the law. Go and change the law. That's what the judge says. He was too diplomatic. He didn't use the words I'm using. We judge Norway is sophisticated. Yeah, sophisticated. I find no mandash. As somebody was asking me, what's the difference? Is Mandash alone in this debate? I said, no, Mandash is not alone. And there are some of us just put it crude. Some of us are putting more in a level of sophistication. I've worked with Mandash. I've grown up with him. We met at high school. He was 17, I was 15. 52 years ago. So I know him better than anybody else. So we require a level of sophistication. Let me leave you and say to you, we're doing everything possible. We're putting resources, as I've indicated here, to get out of gray listing. It is not where we want to be. It's not where we want to be. Is one of those areas out of my problems that I've highlighted. The downgrading, I'm not worried about it. I'm quite fine, because the more I get better out of downgrading by rating agencies, I'll be more having pressure to look at the ratios. At the moment, I'm not looking that much at the ratios. I'm more concerned about how do I make strategic choices. But the more I get better rating, hey, I want to go better, I've got to look at the ratios. So, but this one is worrying me. the grey listing. But there's an opportunity in the sense that we can make a lot of changes in a number of areas, whether it's border management, whether it's anything else, and put the legislation in place fairly quickly in order to meet the FATF. So my message to you, don't be despondent. Work is being done. It's my duty as a minister not to leave you hopelessly here. It's to tell you this minister is working. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Minister. And of course, that one particular shade about the 30% pass mark is something that we all didn't miss. A pass mark of 100% is indeed the way things need to be, and we do need to work towards getting that. And of course, last year we did see some efforts in trying to avert the inevitable, but unfortunately they did come a bit too late. But it's definitely something that we all need to address as a country. Now, there was something that happened this week that a lot of people are not aware of. Before we decided that this was the venue we were going to use, I sent someone to check the ceiling of the venue. And the one thing that I wanted to make sure that there was no chandelier in this particular venue. And a lot of people would think that was strange. But the reason I wanted to make sure that there was no chandelier here is that we are about to listen to a presentation about how South Africa's grey listing crisis happened. And that presentation is called The Sword of Damocles. So those of you that in your spare time read something about Greek mythology and all of those fancy things will know that there was once a story of a guy who was very, very good at promoting his king and saying, you're the greatest person that ever lived and all of those things. And this guy was Damocles. And this one time, the king then says to him, well, actually, I want you to come and sort of experience what it feels like to be me. So he puts him on the throne, and then he's surrounded by all these fancy things that kings tend to be surrounded by. And one thing that he did is that directly above his head, above the throne, was a sword that was hanging by a single piece of string. And the point of that was to highlight to him how fragile that position of authority can be. So when Stuart put together this report and I looked at the term, I was like, I'm fascinated about why they chose to title The Sword of Damocles, but you can imagine that when he explains to us that reasoning, he'll give us some insights onto why it's important not to have a chandelier in this particular building because we don't want another threat. So thank you very much, Lungisa, for making sure that we got this particular building. Now I'm about to call on stage someone who's actually in exile. And the only reason I know that he's in exile is that whenever I try to go in exile myself, which I did a lot last year, I'd always stumble upon him. So whenever I needed to have a bottle of wine in London, it was very clear that with the exchange rate that's been deteriorating over the years, Minister, I couldn't afford to buy my own bottles of wine. So it's always useful to be able to call upon someone and say, I want us to discuss very critical national matters. We are all sitting in London, but we're discussing South African critical matters. And the only reason I did that is because Stuart always then pays for the wine. And he's here today. I believe Standard Bank is covering the wine today, but when Stuart goes back to London, and if you guys go to London and you want to be able to access wine without having to pay, Stuart Theobald is your man. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaya. I better get drinking to make sure I get equilibrium in the balance of wine consumption here. Good evening, Minister Godongwana and distinguished guests, and thank you very much to ABSIP and Poro for inviting me to say a few things. I should point out that the title that Kaya referred to, The Sword of Damocles, was the report that we put out in October last year when that sword was still well suspended. A bit like that sculpture in the foyer, and there might not be a chandelier, but that could be dangerous. That sword has now descended, and we find ourselves in a position of grey listing. Back in October, in our assessment of the things we needed to do to try and avoid grey listing, came to the view that we had an 85% chance of being grey listed, that the odds were against us. And I remember Lungisa shooting virtual daggers when we said that. But it was important at that point that we have spurs to action, that we have a sense of crisis as a country to mobilize what needed to be done to try and avoid that grey listing. And I know the Minister and the Treasury team did do a great deal to do that. And we've heard about those 2 omnibus bills that were brought through Parliament in record time. So I'm going to talk a bit about the process that got us to that point. give you some views of what we need to do to escape the grey list, and then also talk about some of the economic consequences that being on the grey list is going to mean to us. And I'm going to squash that all into the 15 minutes that I have. So let me not waste time. This is a bit about the background. And I think one thing that's important to note here is this started back in 2019 when the FATF observation team undertook peer review research. Now, 2019 was a bad time. It was, I think, at the peak of frustration post-state capture, when we felt prosecutions weren't happening, that we weren't dealing with that legacy. And that's precisely when that team was in country. It took a while for them to get out the report, the mutual evaluation report, which was delayed by COVID and so on, and came out in October 2021. And at that point, a clock started because there was a set of recommendations that the country needed to comply with in order to avoid grey listing. Fast forward around August, a bit later, South Africa submits the technical compliance report, the Treasury team having worked incredibly hard to put that together. Then we get to December and we heard about January to the trip to Morocco, that vast number of officials going off to make the case for face-to-face meetings with FATF counterparts. And from what I hear, there was some extremely hard questioning. There was no light touch going on in that FATF engagement with government. February 2023, the FATF plenary happens, and we are told that we are grey listed. I just want to give a bit of technical insight as to how FATF works and how it thinks. There are these terminologies that it has that are quite crucial in the approach that it takes. There are these 40 FATF recommendations. These are a list of things that our laws and regulations need to comply with. In a way, it's the easy part of the story. We can write legislation, put it on the books, and it's done. Then there's the 11, what are called immediate outcomes. And this is an effectiveness assessment. And it says, okay, you've got things on the books, but are they effective? Are we seeing people going to jail for doing the kinds of things that those laws are forbidding? In that mutual evaluation report, we were given 12 priority actions as well. Now, South Africa was found to only comply with about half of the recommendations, but was found to fall short on the effectiveness on all 11 effectiveness measures. Now, let me say this, that I think our political colleagues will be too polite, but no country complies with all of these, no one. And FATF's process is somewhat diplomatic in nature in when it decides that a country falls short and should be grey listed. There's no wiggle room on the 40 recommendations, but the extent of effectiveness is a somewhat subjective assessment. And the Treasury team can tell me whether they agree. And if the effectiveness is where our problems really lie. We said back in October that there are a couple of real blockages. One is in the criminal justice system. FATF then was eager to see that money laundering was being dealt with as a primary crime. Every money laundering prosecution in South Africa tends to be a secondary crime. So people have committed fraud or they've done other things, and money laundering gets tacked on top of that. But FATF said for a country like ours, there very likely is big money laundering operations. All they're doing is cleaning criminal proceeds and laundering it into the formal monetary system, but there are no prosecutions for that. There was also, as we've heard, considerable concern about prosecutions for terrorist financing. There is also the beneficial ownership regime. Considerable concern from FATF that you can't identify who the beneficiaries are of many jurisdictional bodies, whether it's trusts, whether it's companies, whether it's NGOs, and we need to change that. Now, that is a considerable institutional reform, to capture all of that information, to record it, to make it available to the criminal justice system for investigations is a very complex task. And in our view, particularly on trusts, which require all the master's officers, the NPO directorate to register NGOs, there was too much to do in the time that we had before the FATF plenary. FATF's verdict comes out grey-listed, and they gave us 8 different things we need to fix. We need to increase outbound assistance requests. So this is the criminal justice system saying to their counterparts in the rest of the world, we're investigating things. We think you might have information. You might be able to support our investigations. We're sending you formal requests to do so. It appears that our criminal justice system doesn't do this nearly enough. Improve risk-based supervision of the non-bank financial institutions. These are dealers in high-value goods, Krugerrand dealers, second-hand car dealers, and so on, attorney firms, who all are involved in transactions involving large amounts of money that could be potentially used for money laundering. Ensure that competent authorities have timely access to beneficiary information. That's that point we had been concerned about. Demonstrating increase in law enforcement agencies' request for financial intelligence from the Financial Intelligence Center. I talk to bankers, and there has always been great frustration about the huge systems that are required for a bank to detect suspicious transactions and to convey that information to the Financial Intelligence Center, where it appeared that it would sit and nothing would happen. And that concern is flagged by FATF. That is this information being accessed and used in criminal processes. Are we enhancing the identification and confiscation of the proceeds of crime? We know about the asset forfeiture unit. We do see the headlines. Are we effective in winning the court cases to keep and confiscate that money? Updating the terrorist finance risk assessment of South Africa. Implementing targeted financial sanctions. So when the UN puts someone on a sanctions list, do our institutions absorb that information? Are our banks conscious of whether any of its clients or potential clients are on those lists? So those 8 issues were flagged. In our view, here are how likely we are to deal with these. Now, we still have a timeline. FATF will review, and we have the potential to exit in 2025, and that really needs to be a target that guides action. Some of these are fairly easy to comply with, but as the minister has already said, there really is challenges in the criminal justice system. We've talked about the money that has been allocated, but allocating money doesn't recruit the kinds of skills that we need here. The Financial Intelligence Center needs to double its staff. It needs to hire forensic analysts, people who can do huge data software analysis. These are scarce skills at exactly the same time that all the banks and other designated institutions are requiring to hire the same skills. It's not going to be easy. These people are hard to come by. We need to increase investigations and prosecutions of money laundering. That requires the Hawks, the police, crime intelligence, and so on, to have the capability and the people to do this. They might have the money, but it's a big gap to demonstrating effectiveness. Effectiveness means investigating, leading to prosecutions, getting people into jail. That has to be the standard that we're judged on. And at the moment, we're falling far short. And we're concerned that even in the year, 2 years that we have ahead of us, these are going to be huge obstacles to overcome. And I think to the minister's point, as a finance minister, you can create the resources, but this requires urgent action by many other parts of government working in concert together, as well as, by the way, the private sector. And this doesn't get said often enough, that when Vukile and his team go to Parliament to introduce the omnibus bills, who do they get opposition from? Is it the NGOs saying, we don't want to register, we don't want this additional bureaucracy? Is it the estate agents saying, we don't want to have to look at the proceeds of the money that people are buying houses with? There's plenty of work for the private sector to do to align with government's efforts. Let me move on to the economic impact of grey listing. There's really 5 different areas that I want to talk about, but I want to say one thing up front. It is hard to make any reliable estimates on the economic impact, and anyone who's giving you numbers are giving you false confidence. You cannot have a high confidence level on what the impact is going to be. But I'll talk about some of the influence and causes that we think are relevant. So first, we've heard about enhanced due diligence, and this is required in some circumstances. So the European Union requires its accountable institutions, its banks, to immediately implement enhanced due diligence of all South African exposures. The UK does the same for its banks. Other jurisdictions don't formally, but I can tell you, having spoken to compliance people in American banks, that they use it anyway, even though they don't have a formal regulatory requirement. Now, that enhanced due diligence means extra documentation, more engagement with senior management, more time. So it's a transactional cost to all business that is happening with foreign counterpart banks. There's a reduced appetite for South African relationships. How many banks want to go through that process? We've already seen, and maybe the bankers in the room can tell us more about this, but we've already seen banks in other parts of the world just closing to South African financial flow receipts. So we've had money sent back to us from banks in Brazil because they won't accept any remittances from South African banks any longer. So those kinds of risks are there, very difficult to account for. And we also have ways that we'll learn to adapt. So how can we remit money through different mechanisms? There's a funding constraint, a funding impact. We know about the JET IP, that $8.5 billion to finance the just energy transition. A large part of that is meant to come from the European Investment Bank. South Africa's grey listing put South Africa onto a blacklist for EU official institutions, and the European Investment Bank, in theory, can no longer fund South Africa. Now, they will gain exemptions, hopefully. There's a way they'll find to get around the formal requirements, but that is now a formal requirement. There's the capital markets impact. This is, we think, a short, not a significant impact. No large global asset manager is going to have any attention paid to FATF requirements. Other than within ESG mandates, FATF grey listing can be used as a governance indicator within models for ESG risk. But that's a fairly minor within the overall capital flows in capital markets. But there's a second order effect, which is reputational. It's just not a good look to be grey listed. It's an indication for people who have only a passing knowledge about South Africa. It's less than 0.5% of the world's GDP. They'll say, oh yeah, it's grey listed. That's all I need to know. And that reputational damage is quite difficult to quantify, but it's likely to cost more than a sponsorship deal for a UK Premier League football team. So there will be a cost there. How do you add these things up? There's been a lot of research done on the impact of FATF grey listing, but it's very hard to learn and apply that to South Africa's situation. We're not the biggest economy to be grey listed. Turkey, Pakistan, Philippines are bigger than us. But if you look at domestic equity capital market capitalization, we're a much more sophisticated financial system than any market that's previously been grey listed. I'm going to say something very economist-like. On the one hand, that sophistication means we have multiple channels for financial flows, and not all of them will be affected by grey listing. And where those that are affected will have a displacement effect. So if we can't go and borrow money from banks, we can issue bonds through our capital markets, as an example. So there'll be a displacement effect enabled by the fact that we're in a sophisticated economy that isn't overly reliant on one channel. But on the other hand, we are very internationally connected. Our financial system is globally integrated. And that means that FATF grey listing will affect us in those international relationships. And I can't tell you what's going to dominate. There's one study that's most cited, which was by the IMF, which did a review of 89 countries that had been grey listed over the last 20 years or so. And National Treasury, or the Budget Review, I think, referred to this research as well. And it tells you that when grey listing happens, there's this big dip in capital flows into a country, but then it recovers. Now, I don't think South Africa has experienced this big dip, and that indicates that our economy is quite different to those that have come before us. we hadn't seen any movement, definitely not in equity markets. And to the extent that there was any impact in bond markets, it had already been priced in. It wasn't a surprise to the market that we were grey listed. So this is the most cited study, and we don't think it applies to South Africa. So we have this, and when we published this originally last year, people got very cross with us because we said in a worst case scenario, there's a 3% of GDP impact. But let's be clear about worst case scenario. That is an environment in which this reputational blow is not responded to by South Africa, where we just get on with life and say, well, we'll live with it. You know, we lost our credit grade as well. We're living, we'll just live with this. We're not going to really bother. In that scenario, the reputational impact is far more severe. Foreign counterparts are much less likely to put up with the hassle of doing business with us. And we get squeezed in many different routes in access to finance. But the benign scenarios where we're perceived to be taking this very seriously, we're perceived to be actively working hard to get off the grey list, and that it's a very short-term thing. That's the scenario we want the rest of the world to see. And it requires all of us as ambassadors for our financial system to make sure that that is the reality that we communicate to our global counterparts. And if we get that right, people will put up with the inconvenience of doing business with us, and the economic impact will be minimal. Let me just say in closing, the president said on Twitter that FATF grey listing is an opportunity, and he got roasted. I think it was rare to somewhat come to his defense and say, you know, actually, there are opportunities here. The minister talked about our criminal justice system being a real economic problem, as well as a problem for all of our lives and our daily lives. It is an economic cost in many ways to how we do business. And it's a very hard problem to solve because it runs throughout institutions across the public and private sectors. FATF grey listing creates a burning platform and a spur to action that wouldn't be there. FATF grey listing is a proximate indicator of a fundamental problem in how the criminal justice system works in our country. It's a symptom. It's not the cause of our problems, but it's a symptom that allows us to understand the illness more clearly and to understand the treatment that we need for that illness, and maybe to get the patient to actually swallow those pills that we wouldn't have been able to do without grey listing. And in that sense, there is an opportunity here. There's a spur for action for both the public and private sector to work together to fundamentally change our criminal justice system, not just to get off a FATF grey list, but to improve the economic capacity of the economy as a whole. And I'll leave you with that, hopefully positive message that we do have an opportunity here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, the provider of wine for those of you that want to visit London. I do think that, you know, having listened to this report, we probably have a bit more insight into what led us here and to what needs to be done going forward. And I do acknowledge that I was one of those that roasted the president because I said, look, surely there must be cheaper ways to learn lessons and identify opportunities, and grey listing shouldn't be the way in which we identify these particular opportunities. But nevertheless, here we are. And on that note, we thought it would be quite useful to get some insights onto the leaders of the financial system and the leaders of business to get an understanding of what exactly it all means to be where we are today. Now, the three panelists were chosen with a very, very specific intent. They've all been hostages of mine at some particular point in time. The very first hostage is the CEO of Standard Bank South Africa. And the very first time we held him hostage, it was during a fees must fall conversation at DBSA. And it was supposed to have been a 1-hour meeting. And I think 7 hours later, he still hadn't left the room because the students were saying, look, you run treasury, you've got the money. So until you can tell us how we're going to solve the fees must fall crisis, you're not going to get out of this room. And interestingly, some of those students, would you believe, were there yesterday at the Sandton Convention Center. Guess what? They held him hostage and they forced me to sit right next to him because apparently the only person they can ensure he doesn't run away. So today he gets to sit right next to me again. Lungisa Fuzile, the CEO of Standard Bank South Africa. So when we talk about student activists, we tend to look at them as, you know, those rogues that don't know how systems work, and then one day we'll forget about them. Unfortunately, I have to tell you guys, student activists eventually do grow up. And when they grow up, they become new types of problems. So Kes Kuvadia has been on this since the early 80s, where even when he was in Lodium, he was known as the type of person who was, you know, pushing the system to do things differently. So his activism and his anti-apartheid stories are very well versed. And of course, when they grow up, we then put them on the other side to be responsible for the problems that they used to identify. So that's how we ended up running the Banking Association of South Africa for about 15 years. And now he is at the Business Unity of South Africa, Mr. Kes Kuvadia. Okay. So, Minister, one of the most important things about load shedding, I mean, everybody's got a reason why load shedding must end. But for some people, load shedding is important. Well, it's important not to have load shedding because they like watching TV. And watching TV is probably not the type of thing that you think would feature prominent in a conversation of this nature. However, it turns out that many, many years ago, some student who thought she was going to be a doctor, but actually cannot tolerate blood, I don't understand how that does work. She thought she was going to be a doctor, and then one day her mother held her hostage. They were sitting and watching TV, and then somebody on TV started talking about Rwanda, you know, the economic profile of Rwanda and the things that are happening there. And then suddenly she was like, yo, I can get away from the blood. I'm going to go and study economics. And that is the chief economist of FNB, Mamelo Matikitsangwenya. Thank you very much. So far, I've been nice. It all ends now. Lungisa, I want to start with you. I mean, over the past couple of days, I've been locked up with lawyers and judges at the Gallagher Convention Center, and I had to answer the question of, if South Africa has got the best constitution in the world, why is its economy on the extreme opposite? What's the link between the two? And we had huge fights and nobody could answer the question. Similarly, when it comes to the banking system in South Africa, I think a lot of people have said it's probably one of the most sophisticated, one of the most rigorously regulated, most robustly regulated. So it's a system that works. And yet when we then hear about this grey listing, everyone's like, yo, it gives the impression that actually South Africa's financial system at large is a mess. Reconcile those positions for us.
It's not hard to reconcile them, but in reconciling them, I've got to be careful not to end up defending my own turf, because it doesn't help in this case. If South Africa is grey listed, South Africa is grey listed. It doesn't matter which part of the system is responsible for that grey listing. So it's important to understand that perspective. But if you go through the mutual evaluation report, and the minister almost said this, but stopped himself from saying it. I could read from his lips that he was about to say that at one point, the financial sector was not found to be part of the system that's weak and therefore leads to the consequence of the grey listing. Stuart was making this point that we have got systems, we have got people to identify suspicious transactions, to enforce the anti-money laundering laws. Now, we think we're doing a good job of it. And I'm yet to find an instance where someone says there is this particular transaction which has got all the looks of being suspicious, but one institution didn't catch it. I'm yet to find that. We pass them to the relevant authorities. Then something has got to happen about them, and the entire system has got to process them. Minister Kodongwana spoke about that. The other parts of the system have been found wanting. I mean, if you look at those 8 points, they don't relate to the banks, right? Not at this stage. But as I said, does it really matter? I mean, you know, we have been grey listed, nevertheless. So as a country, what we then need to do is to say, how do we use the stronger part of the system to bolster the weaker part of the system, which is where we are.
We have interacted with almost all of the law enforcement agencies, and they have asked for very specific things. They have said, you guys understand the financial system better. You are supposed to have the people and the IT systems that catch these things, that know all the features of the criminality associated with transactions or financial activities. We need you to help us, because when you're going to build a case against person A who has done one or some other wayward thing, you need someone who is as sophisticated in understanding the crime as that person or better. And they've admitted, they say they fall short. So we've devoted resources, financial and people, to helping bolster that part of the system. Now, time will tell whether it's working. I mean, it takes a hell of a long time to build a case, present it, but the signs, Kaya, are very good. I mean, there have been instances where cases have been processed, but there's a guy, and I'll pause after this, who wrote a book, and I worked with him many years ago about fighting corruption. Says, until you catch a big fish and you fry it in public, people don't believe your efforts of fighting corruption. And that's the difficulty that South Africa has. And we had ours, and when I say this, I'm not lamenting that there was Zondo Commission, but ours was played out in public. It is there in volumes. So people are waiting for some of the names that are listed there. And they're saying, I can see them chasing that little guy or woman. Until they go for that big fish, I will not be convinced. And when they say that, I don't think that people the world over are looking for the system to be unfair, to be unjust, and say that I've committed a crime if I have not. But if something has been said about me in the Zondo Commission, the system must test that and have the relevant part of our system, in this case, I would say the NPA, saying there is no case for Lungisa to answer. Alternatively, there is a strong enough case for Lungisa to answer, and then have a judge exonerate me. What doesn't work is to have the commission, have the volumes, and then see no one being pronounced as needing to answer something or being exonerated.
Cass, I want to explore this interplay between the financial system and the justice system. And on this side, my curiosity is that the justice system, they tend to come in once something has happened. So if there's a body on the floor, then the police say, oh, there's been a murder. So in this particular instance, it would seem that the burden for activating or alerting all of us that something has gone wrong would be the banking system, the financial system, where something has to be identified as a red flag and then escalated to the law enforcement authorities. They may turn out not to be very good at reacting to that, but do we at least have that particular process flow as strong as it should be?
In the financial sector, yes, I think we do. I mean, when I was at the Banking Association and I was there at the time, state capture was quite prominent and the Guptas were prominent and so on. And the banking sector and particularly the major banks actually acted with alacrity in identifying and making available to the FIC office flags that were being identified. And this is the thing about the South African financial sector. I mean, we, as the minister said, it's conservative. We have lots of questions about its role in the particular context we find ourselves in South Africa, and we can debate that and deal with it. But the financial sector, one itself, because of its conservative nature, has the systems and processes in place to actually identify unusual activity and to actually report that to the FIC. What happens subsequent to that is the issue. But also, I think the financial sector in South Africa is exceptionally well regulated. I think the Reserve Bank and the banking regulator have played a phenomenal role in keeping South African banks on their toes. So when Standard Bank gets fined $100 million, not because they've been guilty of allowing money laundering to happen, but because the Reserve Bank find that the systems are lacking and they need to strengthen their systems. So between the bank's own actions and the Reserve Bank's regulation to be at the cutting edge of best practice regulation, I think the banking sector has the systems and processes in place to actually identify these things, send them to the relevant authorities, and now to hopefully close the loop, as Lungisa says, to provide capacity to those authorities to try and do something about it. So I'm quite convinced that the banking sector in South Africa, and not just the banking sector, the financial sector as a whole, has a system and processes in place. And this was shown during the height of state capture. And we had lots of discussions at the Banking Association board on this. And it was quite clear that banks were doing everything they could to actually flag these things and send them to the FIC office. But one of the issues that FATF has raised in the 8 outstanding issues is that the authorities that should be responsible for following it up and building the cases and prosecuting hasn't been talking to the FIC office often and getting the information from them. And that's what we need to try to know.
I'm still curious, what do banks do with these red flags? Because if you go to the SIU's Twitter page, and we should all go there, there's always a case study that they provide every week, in that somebody opened up some random bank account. It had 50 Rand for about 2 or 3 years, and then suddenly it had 10 million Rand in one day, 15 million in the day after. So when we now read it from the SIU's timeline, it's like, look, somebody opened up this bank account. Clearly, there should have been a system that says, well, this thing has never had more than 10 Rand before. Why is it suddenly 10 million? And yet these things carry on, money moves in and out. So we have a sense of curiosity about what happens once the red flags are there.
Sure. So, and
Lungisa, I think you're
Lungisa,
planning to answer this.
I think
Sorry,
Lungisa
no,
should
no,
come
no,
in.
it's a very important thing. I mean, we make the mistake. You will not find me chasing the person whose account has got suspicious activity, doing a citizen's arrest and taking them to the nearest police station and then leading the evidence. No, it's actually the confusion we create in the system. And it's good you're asking it, Guy. I know that you are asking it for other people's edification. It is important to understand who has got to do what. And when there is a failure in a particular part of the system, put pressure on that part of the system. And if needs be, if you've got to channel resources or build capacity in that part of the system, do so. Don't go to the part that works and kick it harder. You are not going to get the results you want. So in essence, something that I mean, Stuart was getting to it, okay. We identify almost all of this stuff. That's why I was saying, rather subtly perhaps, I am yet to find an instance where someone comes and says, there has been suspicious activity happening here. This is why we say it is suspicious, but you never reported it. We would have been fined. The fine that Standard Bank got was purely, and I'm not saying or reducing it, we must file the suspicious transactions, excuse me, in X days. And we were doing it for reasons of volumes a few days later. And I mean a few days later. Now, because the rules that we have in our IT systems were catching way too many transactions, some of them were not really supposed to be caught as suspicious transactions. But as you would know, artificial intelligence works on the basis that it must get a lot of information, and then later on, it gets a bit clever and it can sift the real problems from false problems.
Yeah.
But the system, insofar as the banks are concerned, has not been found wanting. Now, I want to be clear on this so that people don't say, oh, he said the system is perfect. I imagine that there might be one or some other instance where we miss this, but it's not systemic. And I can assure you, even in the rules of a strict FATF. They are not saying that we want you to show that you catch everything. If your system at a systemic level has got sufficient strength, rigor to pick all suspicious transactions and do something about them. I mean, for instance, South Africa took an extraordinarily long time to set up what we call SAMLIT. Don't ask me what it stands for. These acronyms are a problem because then you forget what it actually stands for. But in essence, I can describe that what it affords us is that you can bring together all the parties that have got touch points of transactions that relate to person A. We took forever to get to that, but that's the only way you can begin to say, but this Lungisa fellow keeps receiving money, opens accounts and closes them, or does whatever is suspicious. You've got to get the complete picture on a particular person. Now we have that, but we need to do more. The minister was right, and we do need to do more and do it very fast. We know the parts of the system that don't work well. We really do. Now, if we waste time, of course, let me first say, as banks, we need to, as financial services institutions, we need to step up our game and make sure that we don't regress. And to the extent that there may have been weaknesses that have not yet been picked up, we must pick those and strengthen the system. But the law enforcement agencies, using the money that Minister Godongwana has given them, they must create positions, hire the people, have the people who have got the know-how, train those new people, and that process is going to take a long time. That's what he was saying. And then process the people through the court system. Of course, you don't have to wait for this. You've got to pick a few big fish and fry them in public to show that the system has got teeth and it is determined to rid itself of problems.
Okay. Mamela, as I said, I disagree with the president when he said this represented an opportunity, but I think I might be warming up to what he was trying to get to. Because what I'm sitting here thinking is that the banking system, the reason we invited the banking system here is that they seem to be at the forefront of the most obvious consequences of grey listing. They are also the ones that are regulated quite rigorously. And I'm trying to figure out, can the banks then leverage that particular position to say, look, if you want to regulate us, you cannot regulate us in a vacuum, because if you regulate only this one part and you neglect that part, when something goes wrong, it comes back to bite us. Isn't that the way to go?
I think the panelists have touched on that quite extensively, and I think Cass spoke to it quite nicely, just in terms of how involved the Banking Association was during the time of the Gupta saga. So I think it is quite important to understand where the weaknesses are in the system and where the strengths are, and to allow the banks to do what they do quite well. I think Mr. Lungisa has spoken to it quite well, that the banking system has its relative strength and it has its place where it can act. So I think we need to give them that freedom and that space to do that.
Okay. Stuart, you and I are outsiders from this particular South African banking system, and you and I will remember Ian Stinton from Standard Bank presenting at the Zondo Commission. We remember the stories about the Bank of Baroda. There's a lot of people sitting outside who say, well, actually, the banks may think they're doing well, but if Ian Stinton could go there and give us this entire crash course of how those bank accounts are being managed, if the Bank of Baroda, being part of the South African banking system, could then say, they're a problem for you, FNB, bring them this side. I'm not sure we've got all of the boxes right, have we?
Well, where's Bank of Baroda today?
Flourishing somewhere.
Not in this country. Look, things go wrong in banking, and there are plenty of examples around the world that make that clear. And there are examples in South Africa from time to time. That doesn't detract from the fact that we have outstanding regulation of the banking system. Regulation has to enable for things to go wrong, but limit the costs. That is what effective regulation does. And Baroda, is a specific example, and it was dealt with. Maybe we could say too late, maybe, but it was dealt with when it became clear the extent of the problems there. So, the regulation in the banking sector works. I think it's the regulation outside of the banking sector that we have the biggest problem, the hardest problems to solve. And the financial system is to some extent powerless on how do we get into the cash economy and how do we regulate that. It doesn't touch the financial system. And I think to Lungisa's point that banks and financial system can only do so much. We have to work as a coordinated whole. And it's the parts of the whole that there are weaknesses on that we need to address.
Yeah, Cass, that coordination happened. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw suddenly in Parliament that you can actually put an omnibus bill where absolutely everything is brought together and people are rushing against the clock to actually get things done. And it was done. I think a lot of people already knew that it was probably a bit too late. So suddenly we've got this reference point that when actually there is a crisis, or when we push into a corner, we can get things done. And I'm sitting here thinking that surely in 2019, when that report, that evaluation was done, somebody must have raised a hand and said, guys, we're going to be in trouble unless we start doing this now. Surely we cannot be a country whose leaders say, let's hope something emerges, and then we're going to rush this process in 2022. What happened from the moment we knew that we were at risk?
Yeah, so, and this is where I agree with you and disagree with Stuart. We need to stop in this country waiting for crises to become opportunities before we do anything.
The president loses again.
So we have crises, we have a crisis. And we're dealing with a whole lot of other stuff, and we don't actually recognize. And to a certain extent, with all due respect to the minister and the Treasury, and Saab has done a great job in actually trying to avoid what's happened. But there are parts of government that don't actually recognize the sensitivity of some of the actions taken elsewhere that have on the financial sector in this country. And as a result of that, on the economy of this country. So you know, we say, oh no, it's some guy sitting in Paris, they're not going to do anything about this. Well, we should have acted then. That's why when somebody in government says, well, you know, we tried to avoid this, but now it's here, we've got to deal with it and so on. Well, we didn't try to avoid it. We didn't try hard enough to avoid it. And look, at that time, let's also be clear, we were in the midst of the Zuma years, we were in the midst of state capture, and we were on the law and order side, on the security side, on all of that, we had other priority lines, right? But we should have seen this. We should have said that we could have avoided this and we should have come together. I think the financial sector and the Reserve Bank, I think, started raising the flag, started doing things, started talking to FATF about it, but other parts of government just did not see it as a priority. And so, you know, it was a crisis then. We didn't have to wait for it to play out, right? And that's why I don't see this as an opportunity. We shouldn't have to wait for grey listing to deal with the significant challenges we have in law and order. Okay, the crisis hit us during the Zuma years, and it's gotten worse since then. Yeah. We should have started dealing with it then. So we should have dealt with it. Why didn't we deal with it? There were other priorities, but also I think that there are some in government that just said, well, you know, the financial sector is fine and we have other priorities and not too much will come out of this. Well, hopefully we come out of this quickly and it doesn't happen again.
My worry about the president's Monday newsletter, he publishes them at around 6 a.m. on Mondays, is that it may have inadvertently given the impression that he was trying to downplay it. And the reason that worries me is that, as you've just said now, we shouldn't wait for a crisis. But for the head of state to come and then say, look, it's not that bad, I don't think that injects a sense of emergency from even the parts of the system that didn't do their job, unlike the Treasury guys. That's my concern now, Cass.
No, I agree with that. I think that we've got to recognize the situation we are in. And Stuart's presentation indicated that it's difficult to quantify. It's not Armageddon. It's not the end of the world. But on the back of our economy shrinking by 1.3%, on the back of the rating agencies bringing us down one notch, on the back of the load shedding, on the back of the significant problem we've got in law and order. If you put all of that together, we've got to wake up to the fact that we are a country in trouble. And nobody, whether it's leadership in government or leadership in business or leadership in civil society, should be downplaying that, not because we want to scaremonger. We shouldn't be downplaying those things if we are patriots. As patriots, we need to recognize the crisis and we need to have all hands on deck to deal with the crisis. And if we don't recognize the crisis, then we don't act with urgency to deal with it.
Yeah. Mamelo, actions have consequences. South Africa's economy is already struggling. The data that we got last month from Stats SA showed us that it's a dire position. The Reserve Bank's projections at best say we'll be lucky if we get to 1.5%. So obviously, when we then hear that there's been yet another blow to the South African economy through grey listing, do we then have an idea of what that impact might be on our economy?
I think Stuart answered it quite well in his presentation, and he said anybody that gives you a number is lying. But I just do want to add to the point that Cass is making to your question around, I guess the president looking at the more positive angle to this grey listing. So I think if one looked at literature, and Stuart made reference to it in his presentation, that there is an IMF paper that has been conducted on countries that have been grey listed. And they try to quantify their capital outflows when an event like this happens. And I think the number that they put forward there is around 7.6% of GDP in capital outflows. And when one looks at the SA case and we look through time as to when we've experienced sort of outflows of that magnitude, we experienced it during Nenegate, we saw it in the financial crisis, we also saw it in the COVID pandemic period. So I think perhaps he's looking at that angle, that actually the market didn't react, to the extent that was published in the IMF paper. The currency reacted, but not significantly so. And I think for me, what's quite important is understanding the base that we're starting from. We know a lot of foreign investors have been gradually leaving. So ultimately, when an event like this happens, that base has already been eroded. So I think that's quite important. And just in terms of, trying to quantify the impact of this, Stuart also touched on it, that this is a symptom of something much, much bigger. And what I'm worried about is not necessarily the near-term implications, whether, GDP is going to contract in the next quarter or this year for that matter. So I think if we don't resolve some of these issues, the longer-term implications of it could be quite severe. The minister spoke about not being worried about ratings. I do think if we don't address this, we should be worried about ratings in the future and where the country is ultimately going. Because I think some of these vulnerabilities that these rating agencies, keep pointing out that, per capita GDP is decreasing, vulnerabilities to external factors. And if we look at prices, for instance, as we find ourselves, grappling with load shedding, that, price stability at some point is going to also become quite problematic. So I think we all know that South Africa right now finds itself in quite a dire situation. Whether you believe the central bank's forecast around GDP or you believe ours, it doesn't really matter. I don't think that, we're going to see enough growth over the near term. I think the question really is about the longer term. And if we don't fix the stuff, what does it mean for the longer term outlook for SA?
Stuart, I mean, the country, its credit ratings are a bit diabolical. We are essentially at the bottom. And obviously, every single respecting fund manager would have foreseen what was going to happen. So therefore, we didn't expect that on the day of the announcement, there's going to be this catastrophe. So the question that I'd like to put you is, perhaps we are in such a bad space, everything that would be the impacts that was predicted by the IMF has already happened in one way or another.
You're right, it's priced into the market. So you're not going to see a cliff edge effect. But there is a quiet, less visible dampening of economic activity in that heightened transaction costs that affects the whole economy. And it's not a cliff edge, so it doesn't get the headlines, but it's just one more dampening factor on economic activity. And to Cass's point, we can't be driven in a constant state of crisis and firefighting as our mode of action. We need to be proactive in making the reforms and doing what's needed to proactively put the economy on a positive growth path. And that ultimately has to be the driver of action. And it requires policy reform. The Minister Gorongwana referred to Transnet as that less visible problem that is just as severe. And that is another layer of cost across the whole economy that dampens economic activity.
Yeah.
And we put layer and layer and layer and layer on top of it. And now we pay the consequences. And we need to start stripping those layers out aggressively.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lack of kind of aggressive policy reform to remove those layers that we're suffering from.
Yeah. Lungisa, you've been on the PEP list, the Reuters list for a very long time. So enhanced due diligence is normal to you. But as we saw from the presentation, it's now an entire country that's subject to this enhanced due diligence. Do we have any insights onto what the immediate consequences, whether it's increased transaction costs or whether it's greater lethargy and bureaucracy in transacting with your counterparties? Do we understand what the impact is going to be on the banking system?
We do have a sense. I mean, previously we had a bit of leeway where depending on the categorization of customers, you could do the due diligence at 3-yearly intervals. Now we've got to do it more regularly. I mean, naturally, you can imagine that does mean that it becomes more resource intensive and increases costs. But I mean, I do want to share this. I mean, we saw this problem coming, and whatever the public posture that had been maintained behind closed doors, we were very frank with one another to say the probability of the downgrade is close to 1. Right. So people must just draw that distinction. I mean, I don't expect a leader worth his or her salt to stand on a hilltop and say, South Africa is facing an Armageddon. We are 100% certain will be downgraded. And my God, I must tell you, the world is about to end for us and stuff like that. You won't get that. So if you are surprised by the nuance of President Ramaphosa's letter, then you have not been around long enough, because you don't expect him to say anything else. And by the way, we probably all benefit from him talking up the country. We should therefore not make the mistake to think that it is his duty alone to project a better image of the country. Now, you need not lie. Either way, you don't make the problem worse than it is or better than it is. Just be honest, but have perspective. So, for instance, seeing it coming, Kaya, then meant that all of us, I think, did this as financial services institutions. We had to work very closely with banks that we have correspondent banking relationships with to say, listen, we see this risk coming. We think it could go this way. If it were to go this way, what is it that you would require of us to make sure that you still feel confident to do business with us? You feel that in doing business with us, we are not socializing the risks to your own system. And I must say, the other institutions have been magnanimous, which is why when Stuart was showing that graph, that V shape didn't materialize here. It's because we have been proactive to reach out to the banks that we've got correspondent banking relationships with, so that we can ameliorate, avoid the worst impact of the crisis. Now, the only reason I agreed to participate to this, Kaya, was because we said mapping out South Africa's recovery. And why I say this, not do what South Africans tend to do, which is look for someone to blame for where we are and analyze how grave the situation has been or could have been. The situation is what it is. Don't think that anyone is mad when they say, how do we then cast our minds forward? What do we do to get out of here? Hence, I tend to focus on, I've said that we've done the things to minimize the impact already. But now the important thing is that people who run accounting firms here, forensic firms here, ourselves as financial services, who have got what it would take to strengthen the weak part of the system. We must do that and insist now, before time has run out, that create space for us to assist you, strengthen the weak part of the system. That is the only way we'll get out of this. If we elect otherwise to yell at those who failed to prevent this from happening, I fear that you can end up in a situation where there is a hardening of positions and they drift away from us. And then only when we realize that the next round of being assessed comes, then we try to narrow the gap. It's too late. So we've got to be adult about this and work, double down. I mean, you know, some of you may not know this by virtue of age, and I'm not patronizing you. So when the first Minister of Finance in the Democratic Government, not first, when Trevor Manuel became Minister of Finance, South Africa was not rated. Some of you may not know this. When they go overseas, the road shows used to be conducted by no less than a Minister of Finance, the Governor of the Central Bank, because the fund managers wouldn't meet people like ourselves who became DGs later. They thought that those were junior. They must hear it from the people who really mattered. Makoshi, who's here, she can tell you, they used to draw a map of Africa and say Africa is not one country. It's got whatever number at the time, 50 something countries. No, I'm serious. And say, we are talking here about this country. This is where Mandela comes from. Have you heard about him? And of course, from there, they would build the story. And I'm serious about this. They would explain. And now South Africa has reached the point where it can place a bond without conducting a roadshow. Right? It took people, South Africans, they didn't come from Mars, accepting that we may be there, but we can be high up there. Some may have forgotten South Africa was rated A. Right? Not many countries in the world make it to that grade. And that was because we were not run by another lot of people from elsewhere. It was South Africans. Some of them still walk this earth. So I'm saying to you, it's bad that we are gray listed, but it's not the end of the world. We know why. We have the resources, people, financial, to be able to get out of that. We must just marshal the forces. Sure, sometimes we can criticize each other, but I'm interested in my case more in a conversation that says, how do we get out of where we are?
Cass, we do acknowledge that the state has got resource limitations, and usually it's financial and technical resource limitations. We saw the Solidarity Fund as a template of what can be done to marshal those resources. We now know there's a new resource mobilization fund that's been put together. In relation to the justice sector, however, there are particular tension points in that as soon as you have private players putting in resources to say, we are going to finance those particular investigations, the Steinhoff case being the most glaring example of that, there are tensions that the country still hasn't grappled with, because if it turns out that Business Unity South Africa says we're going to finance that part, and then 2 days later, oops, one of your members is implicated, the legitimacy of the entire process will be severely undermined.
So let me start by fully agreeing with Zungisa. I think that I don't think nobody is saying, I'm certainly not saying that we at Armageddon and that we in a situation where we can't do anything about it. Of course we can do a lot about it. And of course we've got to do it as SA Inc. But I also need to say that, we shouldn't say, deal with these issues, that every time there's a new crisis, we say, well, we've got to start doing this. We've got to start putting people into government. We've got to start working. Well, we're doing that. That's happening. Okay, there are people, private sector people in ESCOM, there's private sector people in the NPA, there were private sector people with the infrastructure fund. So it's happening. What we need to do here is to say which specific institutions need what type of support and capacity, and we need to find that and put that in. But your point, when it comes to the justice system, and we've been having discussions with the NPA on this post-Zondo report, that we can't, in trying to assist and trying to put capacity and create another round of state capture. So we've got to recognize as business that if we're going to assist the NPA in any way, be it with resources, be it with capacity, we've got to find mechanism that we do this at arm's length basis. We do this in a way that does not impact on the independence of the NPA, that the National Public Prosecutor has got to have the only and final say on how capacity and resources are used, and there's got to be a Chinese wall between us and the resources we put in. But those are things that can be worked out. Those are things that we can work out. So the message from me as a representative of businesses through BUSA is that absolutely we want to put in that sort of capacity, and absolutely that's what we've got to do. And that's what we should be concentrating on now. How do we, whether it's by January 25 or maybe a bit later, how do we actually mobilize the necessary resources in the necessary way into the necessary institutions so that we deal with this issue?
All right, get your data talking bundles ready. We're about to come to the floor. We're going to take 5 questions in the first round. And the one thing that I always have to highlight is that I'm the one that is here to greet people and to protocol observe and all of that. So please don't do that. Get straight to the question and keep it as brief as possible. So the first 5 hands, please. President of APSIP, table 3, that's 2 hands. 3 at the very back there, Tapiwa, and then 4 there. Okay, cool, we can start. President.
Thank you, Kaya, and thank you to the panelists for a very robust engagement. It's not a question, it's probably more clarification of the commitment that is being made, because Lungisa, you did say that we are here to map out the recovery, and we're not here to opine on what went wrong. I'm hearing Cass say Business South Africa will put the resources that are necessary. I want to come out of this with clear commitments, because as APSIP, we're going to follow up. So are you saying that on Monday I should come knocking at your door and say, Cass, how do we facilitate this conversation between you and the NPA or whoever is necessary in the security cluster? It is important for us to come out of this conversation with very, very clear, this is what we're going to do on Monday when we wake up. Thanks.
Okay, we'll address those questions after I've taken all the hands. There was a second hand. Go ahead.
Thank you for all the insights that were shared. My question has to deal with form versus substance in the ways that FATF will evaluate our case. And I'd just like to highlight a brief example of HSBC and their activities with certain illicit cartels in Mexico and the US. As an example, in a jurisdiction which is highly perceived to be very credible, yet this still continued for a number of years. It was eventually found out there were no convictions, but there were fines. So by FATF's processes, this is not a perfect example of behavior within a banking system. Yet obviously no one would question that system. So how much of it is the perception, and does FATF insist on having every single criteria fully fixed before saying you may be removed from the grey list? So just that question in terms of how they will evaluate us.
All right, thank you. Third hand was there at the back. Someone at the back has the mic already.
Thank you. I was 4th, but yeah. My question has to do with companies that are outside of the financial and banking sector, like the technology space. Do you think that the gray listing will affect any agreements we have with maybe payment processes like Visa or MasterCard in terms of the existing service level agreements? Will those have to be revised, or are we fine keeping our transactions processed by such companies based abroad?
Thank you. There was another hand.
Thanks. So I think mine is pointed to the panel in general. You know, during state capture and all the investigations around money laundering, etc., we did see quite a bit of disconnect between the way the banks executed, you know, suspicious transactions versus, you know, how our law and judicial system essentially treated it. And I think the general messaging is, you know, there needs to be a joint effort between business and the regulators, etc. How do we marry or unify our messaging to essentially be one between both private and you know, government institutions?
All right, thank you. No more hands. Oh, now we've opened up the floodgates. There was one there at the back, and then back to table one, and then there's a hand here. Yes, Andy will be the last one.
Thank you. I think part of the review looks at the amount of cash that the economy holds, and rather looking at it as more of a corruption, or maybe we haven't seen part 2 of the gold mafia, but I want to look at it in the financial institutions or the financial sector, and what are we doing more to get the unbanked so that we get that cash out of the economy into the system. So what are we doing as the financial institution?
All right, no, thank you. The second hand here. Yeah.
Thank you. In relation to what it costs us to be gray listed, is a possible methodology to look at this in the context of debt servicing costs, as in, does this roll into the overall cost of debt that and payment that we have to incur as a sovereign? And then the sort of half question, and maybe to Lungisa, is following on his theme, is on previous roadshows, et cetera, if you'll recall way back in the day, when we were often met with a reaction from bondholders, et cetera, that South Africans tend to be more too insular and look at the South African challenges in isolation and not compare across the EM group of peers. And therefore we dwelled in our own misery to the extent, sorry, let me leave it there.
All right, thank you. Handi?
Thank you very much. So I thought that Mamelo said something very important about this idea of things happening gradually, you know, so we don't see one big cataclysm. So over a period of time, things get priced in. And I think that's something important, because I think, as Kes also said, in a way, we wait for big crises to respond. So clearly, in finding some solution, we have to find a way. And I'm asking this question for myself, because I guess I get stopped at airports and everywhere else where people are asking me, what is this about? What are we going to do about this? What should we do? You know, from activists to actually sometimes regulators and members of parliament. And it seems to me, maybe, is there a different language you should be using? Because it doesn't seem to me that these are not conversations we've had in private, in public, on TV interviews, on radio. But it seems that, you know, if we are mapping the recovery, we should clearly be mapping a different way of seeing things. Is there a different way of actually speaking about these things? Because it does seem to me that for a long period of time, these are not things that I surprise, but they have been happening. So clearly, maybe we are not having this conversation the right way, or maybe at the right place. Is there a way to do this? And I'm asking this because I have to ask.
All right, thank you, Kanti. We've got one last hand there at the back, and while the mic goes there, I will read 3 questions that have come from the online platform. The first one is, what is the view in terms of when our country will get out of grey listing? Some people have indicated may take a few years. The second question says, can the enhanced measures introduced for PEPs be applied for people who do business with government, for example? And the last one is, how can South Africa provide a strict way to combat fraud that is happening and enhance its monitoring? Then the last question from the back.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. The first One is actually a comment that I think there's something that the panelists are either intentionally avoiding or because we're focusing on the gray list, the focus is there. Because once we speak about the, let's call it 9 wasted years or the era of President Zuma or the Guptas, for me, that's a short sight of how we should best analyze this, because the Guptas, for me, they came and found a system that was working and they just plugged and play. And for them to be found wanting a few years later, that then questions a number of things within the system of banking and regulation within government. And I think once we can go back and say, before the Guptas, what was happening? Because I would assume that the Guptas would not come and say, well, we are these smart people, we can outsmart the system of government, the system of banking, and therefore we're here. So I think we should really speak to those things that before the Guptas, what was really and truly happening that the Guptas found and plugged in play. But
all right,
the last point, sorry, is that the Minister of Finance, there's a point that I think he didn't mention, and I would like a comment from him as well, if he can, that part of what contributed to the levels of our economy today, and also the risks that we are facing today, is the fact that SMME or small to medium companies have been totally neglected in terms of them being financed. And through the regulations that have been put in place. I mean, I would assume a young man from Abopani or Soweto or anywhere, where when he applies for funding, the first thing they're looking for is audited financial statements. Secondly, they say, no, you need a 5-year business plan with projections. Now, that for me also contributed to the economy that's not growing and effectively and eventually leads to all these opportunities that I can't remember who spoke about them, the problems that others find as opportunities. So to the minister, how are you going to, going forward, relax the regulations that at least SMMEs or small to medium companies can equally access funding without necessarily being, your proximity being close to those that are in power? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for those quite challenging questions. And I'd like all of my panelists to engage in them, but in particular, Stuart, if you can take us through the question of the removal process. I think you mentioned 2025, that will be much appreciated. And also perhaps the impact on non-financial banking institutions. I think, Cass, you heard from the president, the call for commitment. So if you could please make sure you address that. Lunges and Memelo, please specifically deal with the questions on the debt service costs. And more importantly, what happens next? Stuart first.
Thanks for the questions. So I think in terms of getting off the grey list, there's a plenary towards the end of 2025, Kile will know, October. I think that is seen by most people as the opportunity where we can undo this, but there is a lot of work. We really have to get the work done in the next year to be ready to have presented the case in time to be considered properly at that plenary. Do I think we'll make it? I hope for the best. But as Zungisa says, behind closed doors, sometimes one has to prepare for things that are not the best. It has been done. Mauritius got off the grey list in 20 months, and that was a record. But it took exceptional concerted political effort in Mauritius, and it's a relatively simple place to do this kind of business. So we do have a big task, and we mustn't be unrealistic. I think Tato asked the point of, do we have to tick every single box? The answer is no. And I made the point that no country does. I think the mutual evaluation report used the term sufficient progress. We have to demonstrate sufficient progress, that we're moving in the right direction. It's gray as to what that means. And those 8 priority actions, if you read the wording, there aren't hard objective tests of whether we've met those 8 things. There is some level of subjectivity. So partly this is a lobby we have to prepare, but we need to have the evidence to back that lobby to achieve what we need. And that evidence, above all else, needs to be successful demonstrations of the criminal justice system working. We need to say, look, they're in jail now. We're not just talking about our plans to prosecute or the charges and so on. The question about non-bank institutions, and I think the question at the back had in mind payments, mentioned MasterCard and Visa. MasterCard and Visa do business in some pretty hairy jurisdictions. You can use your cards in most places. And you know, in our engagements with them, they're not that concerned about grey listing. They worry about it in terms of how it affects the wider economy, but not how it affects their systems directly. I can tell you they're much more worried about things like domestic processing regulations and so on in terms of how their businesses get affected in South Africa. And they're not, you know, it's the non-designated institutions, counterparts in the rest of the world who are not regulated as part of the financial system, do not have to pay attention to this. And we shouldn't expect that they will take actions because of grey listing.
All right, thank you, Stuart. Lungisa?
I mean, there are many questions asked. The difficult ones I'll leave for Memo. The decashing of the system. I mean, the cash is a bit sticky. You know, people get familiar with money before they really know how to walk. And they understand that if I have got this thing and I hand it over to someone, they will give me the sweets. And then later on, they realize that it can buy fancier things like cars and so on. So there's I'm exaggerating a bit for effect, but there are efforts to try and sort of reduce the use of cash. It's interesting because I think out of the horror of COVID, something quite positive came out. Because if you just check the increased use,
not just a COVID test. That was positive.
Yes, Kai. But there was a bit of increased use of, call it, digital platforms, tapping of cards, and people avoiding, you know, the exchange of physical cash and so on. But I suspect that some people have gone back to their old ways. Perhaps what the sub has sought to do with this pay sharp mechanism will take us somewhere also towards decashing. But I'm not way too optimistic that people will give up on cash. They understand it better. They know they have it. They know that unless someone puts a hand in their pocket, then they lose it. With the digital platforms, you can be robbed remotely. I mean, you know, there are all of those complications. But we, as banks, we work with regulators to always try and make sure that you can improve or instill more confidence in the other ways of, you know, exchanging value, storing value, paying, and so on. I'll leave the debt service cost for you, Memelo. But let me just say that this issue of a unified message goes to a point that another member of the audience was making about, you know, or it was Kant, I think. Do we ever find a way to talk the common language about what is it really that we're facing as a problem? And I think sometimes people who work with things make assumptions about everyone. Some of those are very wrong. Why do you think that a person occupying a very important position in law enforcement understands that South African banks are less useful to those who have accounts with them? In fact, they become really less useful if they cease to have correspondent banking relationships. People cannot associate the fact that, you know, you go to the US, you order a meal, you just pay with your card. That they think that this thing has got to happen. If you think about it, but because you guys are sophisticated people, you know that that's not just given. It relies on those people having confidence that that doesn't introduce risks to their system inadvertently. So it's very important sometimes that we explain to each other. Minister, he phoned me the other day. I won't mention names because they would get you into trouble. But he was explaining to me that someone had said something to him which was reflecting lack of understanding of a concept. I mean, I'm talking in very general terms, Minister, but you remember that call. And it's this, that is the stuff.
the more things change.
Yeah, maybe now I've ruined my chances of receiving calls from the minister. But this is quite serious. We do have to sometimes take each other along on matters without patronizing one another. To say, there is this thing, it affects everyone. You mustn't think that it affects the rich people. It affects people who have got or who handle sometimes foreign exchange. No. Foreign exchange does affect you because South Africa import. I mean, people can understand this, people are clever, but explain it in ways that they can understand so that they own it. And for an example, reject notions that suggest that it's not a problem. You know, it only affects the elite or something like that. That is quite important, I think. I'm tempted to respond to the Gupta stuff, but it brings me bad memories.
2015.
Just quickly, I mean, look, the point about it is this. No one ever suggested that corruption came or started with Guptas here. No one ever suggests that. But they mastered it. They mastered it because they infiltrated the system right from the top, which then meant that they had this ability to remove friction anywhere and everywhere. Right? I don't think that they had this ability to be able to say, but that minister is a problem. Unless he gets out of the way, we're not going to make so much, which is our target this year. And the minister would be removed at the drop of a hat. That director general doesn't listen. He better be removed. By sunset, the director general will be gone. A new one would be there who's pliable. And if that one doesn't play ball, two would go. There aren't many South Africans who have done that. If you can show me a South African who has had the ability to do that, then I will pay you. So so it's wrong. I mean, you almost get under my skin when you try to sort of say that what they did has already, they introduced a new phenomenon. It is so hard to deal with it. By the way, the distraction of the law enforcement system that is making us to be where we are in terms of grey listing is a direct consequence of what they did. Because anyone who was difficult got removed. Then their replacements removed the next layer, and they are replaced, though that next layer removed the next layer. And cleaning up that is a mammoth task. But of course, I don't like it when leaders, I don't happen to be one of them, who are in government, talk and sound helpless about this, because you then can get people to lose hope. If you think that 3-4 layers of people in an institution will not get you where you want to get to, then remove them. Of course, follow the law in that process, but remove them. You can't be a leader. If I were to go to my bosses and say, look, there's this problem, but I can't do anything about it, the chances are that they would say, okay, thank you. We thought that you were looking for a job and you were serious about it. We will find someone who will do this job. You know, that's how the system is supposed to work. Yes?
Yeah, so just on the capacity and so on, so when we say that there's a willingness to provide capacity, to provide appropriate expertise and so on, we want to do that in a way that there's a clear objective of what's to be achieved. There's a clear direction from government as well, whatever department or ministry we're working with, that this is how the expertise will be used, and that we see the achievement of that objectives at a point in time. So it's not just willy-nilly throwing capacity and resources at people. So the current example, the Resource Mobilization Fund, present approached business to say his plan is there, NECOM is there. Business thought that the president's plan is a good plan. In fact, it's the only plan going that we've got to implement, and we've got to implement urgently. NECOM, under very difficult circumstances, has been doing excellent work. There's a clear plan, there's clear objectives. What's lacking is expertise. And in those circumstances, we say, let's provide the expertise. And how do we do that? Hands off. We formed a not-for-profit to receive the money, $100 million. We've put together a team of procurement experts to transparently, on the basis of RFIs issued, procure the expertise as determined by NECOM. We've used capacity in business already that's been dealing with seconding people into government and putting those systems into place. CAMDEV, I can't remember what it means either. But in the National Business Initiative, they've got the system. We said we're not going to reinvent the wheel. They're doing all the backroom stuff. And we will donate the expertise to NECOM. And on a quarterly basis, NECOM will come to us and say, look, this is how we're using it, and it's all on track. On the justice system, we're talking to an ex-judge to advise us on how we can do an arm's length thing so that the independence of the NPA is maintained. So we absolutely clear capacity is there. There must be a receptivity in government to accept that capacity. We've got to work together on it, and we've got to do it, but with clear objectives so that after a period of time, we can measure success or failure.
Thanks, Cass. Mamelo?
Thanks. I would just like maybe to start with, I think, a point that has been made quite at length around the issue of grey listing being a system, or a symptom rather, of a broader set of problems. So if we start there, and I think Stuart spoke quite at length around it increases friction costs. And in as, you know, in as far as the issue around debt cost is concerned, so I think the one thing firstly to look at is our sovereign risk, and your debt service ratio is a function or factor of your debt service, your sovereign risk, I beg your pardon. So the minister in the MTBPS, as well as the budget speech, speaks quite at length around, you know, that our debt pile is increasing. And I think, you know, what is important in this case is improving our denominator. So if we don't get growth, it's negative for how we are perceived and our ability to service debt. So I think if we look at this grey listing issue specifically, what we need to fix for is to get the economy going again, because again, it's a symptom, and that's how you sort of circle back to issues around the sovereign risk as well as debt service costs. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So, last one.
The question on PEPs. Most politicians think that, and they try to give the impression, and I might be beaten into a pulp for this because I've got my favorite one in the room. They think that they are the only ones who are being subjected to due diligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. Everyone we bank is subjected to a due diligence process that is proportionate to the risk they pose. I thought I should say that.
I got you. All right. So as the president of APSIP alerted us, we still need to talk about mapping the recovery. So with the assumption that, Stuart, 2025 is the one date that we're chasing, that's the date that we're chasing. It's going to come after this one. So I want you all to think about the one thing that needs to be done between now and then that's going to get us there. And there's only one disclaimer. You will not recommend another presidential task team. Just think about that. Minister, over to you.
I'm not going to talk about that question in the presidential task team. Let me start with the, which was not my question to me, is the timelines to exit.
Yeah.
FATF has given us until January 2025. I think for me, it's a reasonable time frame. Okay, it's a reasonable time frame. Where I sit, we should achieve that before January 2025. We've structured an environment where the entire team of the six still exists to work together now of those departmental officials. We intend to be reporting, to put pressure on them to be reporting to cabinet every quarter in terms of progress. That, in my view, is going to put pressure even on the security cluster to move. On the small and medium enterprise, let me just say the following. In every meeting that I address on this matter, particularly on the regulatory framework, is that we are better if you yourselves advise us on, because you feel the problem. Now, if you are going to ask me, somebody who's never managed even a spaza shop, to come and tell you about the best way of a regulatory framework, it's not going to work. So I may be UPSIP and others organizations that serve a small and medium enterprise. We challenge you to provide us, what are these regulations that need to be changed? What are those regulations that need to be changed? We'll definitely do so. We'll definitely do so. Let me just give an example. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about public procurement and departments, they can't procure. If they say now it's treasury, they're lying, okay? Because what we've done is to develop all procurement to each state organ and to be able to develop its own procurement processes. To the extent that there's a regulation that is affecting small and medium enterprise, I'm more than happy to work with you to achieve that. But what is going to be required? What is going to be required? Accept your point that people say you must project to 5 years and so on. If that's a regulatory environment required by government, we're more than happy to work with you. You know, I normally tell people I used to live in Alberton next to a race course, Newmarket, and therefore I used to play horses. So one of the things I ought to do when I play horses, I look at a combination of two things. Is it a good horse? And does it have a good jockey? Then I can bet on it. So what we should be looking at, is it a good business? Does it have a good, does the person who's going to manage this thing have the capacity? That's a jockey. The person who's going to manage this horse is a jockey, this business. So those are things we need to be talking about. And I agree with you, we are putting a lot of regulatory things to small business, which are unnecessary. We are more than happy, but please develop a document for small business. The third area about this thing is lack of coordination, even government. You know, I had a huge battle with my colleague, Minister of Small and Medium Enterprise, that we're not funding them and so on. Yesterday, I had a meeting with her and her team. I asked her the question. I've done quick check. All provinces combined have got 1.8 billion for small and medium enterprise. What is the relationship between national and province in terms of that work? Little coordination. So part of what I'm saying, we have agreed, rising from yesterday, that in April, we're going to have a meeting with everybody trying to coordinate this work. But it would be useful to have some contribution to yourselves and what are these things that we need to change. Just to go back to the timelines, we would appreciate a collaboration with the private sector on the exit. What form that it should take, I don't know. But that invitation is staying. And lastly, on a lighter note, you know, Ulungisa can throw you under the bus. During that special weekend, when there was a change of a minister, I didn't know who the minister is going to be. I just got to know when that the minister is going. So I phoned Ulungisa, as a friend of mine. I said, hey, Chan, I'm told you've got a new minister. It's likely to be a Gupta minister. That's what I said to him. In all probability, they normally come with a truck full of advisors. That's what you are likely to get. Now, Ulungisa go to Zondo Commission. He tells Zondo all the story.
A snitch of notes. Thank you, thank you. Stuart, final words from you, and no, not another presidential task team, please.
We've got a lot to do, but I think we've talked a lot about the actions that are happening. It's encouraging. I agree with Lungisa that we mustn't forget the optimism that comes from knowing we've done this before, and we turned around the fiscal system of this whole country. And You talk to economics classes today, they won't believe that we ran 5 quarters of 5% GDP growth, that we had debt ratios in the 20%. We achieved incredible things. We know we can do it. And we've got to tap the goodwill that exists across the world to see South Africa succeed and to find it within ourselves to deliver it. But we must be determined, and we must be clear that it's about results. It's not about meaningless task teams.
Thank you. Mr. Snitch.
No, I was under oath, Minister, forgive me. I had to tell, I had to tell everything that. But on a serious note, you know, one of the lessons from Mauritius is that when you have something like this, it helps to have it led right from the top. So I know that you know, Treasury by and large was left to lead this, and thanks to Minister Kodongwana and the acting DG Momo for the sterling work that they did. But Minister Kodongwana cannot fire his peers. So if the department that is failing is Department X, he can first appeal to the gentleman or woman and then become the snitch and go and report to the president that, but Minister Kuvadia is not helpful. Well, that's a long way to solve the problem. So what I'm suggesting is that on something like this, so big, can you imagine how profound it would be if the president had said, he can still say it, by the way, that this thing is so important, I'm gonna run it myself. And ask of each one of the ministers whose departments have got a part that is weak to come with a plan and say, what is it that you're going to do to make sure that problem number 1 is gone, problem number 2 is gone, tell me what resources do you need, financial and otherwise, and I'll get them. But assure me that the problem is gonna go long before 2025. That would be powerful, right? And by the way, that would be the model for a number of other things. There are things that you cannot outsource if you are a leader. You have got to accept that this one is mine. Even if the risk that it doesn't get resolved is high, but by virtue of being in this particular position, I accept the good and the bad that go with it. And then, you know, that's just life.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Now, let me agree with Lungisa and just add to that. I think first, let's recognize from the top that it's not Armageddon, it's not the end of the world, but it's a crisis, okay? Secondly, let's recognize, and the minister said this earlier as well, that the core of the problem for us to address the 8 issues that still need to be addressed is the criminal justice system, okay? So that's where our focus has got to be. Then pull the criminal justice system together, which only the president can do. These are the things that need to be done. I want a plan and tell me what resources and capacity we need. And then the president must unequivocally say that we will pull the best resources and capacity available in the country, irrespective of where they sit, and we will put them onto this issue. And that's what we've got to do.
Thank you very much, Cass. Mamelo, final word from you.
Thanks, I'll keep mine short. I think this idea of a capable state is quite important, not just with this issue, but a lot of the issues that we're facing with. And I think if we can get that right, and I think as a society, as an economy, if we are orientated behind one mission, that would be my advice or my parting words, that if we can get that right, it will help us to solve a lot of the issues that we faced with.
Thank you very much. The road to 2025 begins now. We all have a responsibility to do something, but of course the leadership has to come from the very top, because imagine all of us saying that we're going to do this, we're going to help here and there, only for us to be told, "Uba and when." That's not going to work anymore. Thank you very much to everybody. I'd like to call on the president, the deputy president of APSIP. He usually does this whole walk thing, lie there, walk, and people clap for him.
Why am I here? I'm here to do the vote of thanks. Yes. In APSIP, coups can happen while you're walking from your table to the stage to do a vote of thanks. But Madam President, I acknowledge you. It's not a coup what I was trying to do. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for making time to be here today. We know you sacrificed a lot of gin, whiskey, and wine in order for you to join us this evening, and we'll release you shortly to that effect. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Honorable Minister. Thank you so much, Minister, for allowing us to remedy the error we had made of not inviting you within the first 20 months. Please expect a lot more consistent invites. We have an event next week if you are available. Secondly, Minister, in the midterm budget, if you can give UPSIP $1 billion, Kaya, myself, and Prudence, we'll follow those 8 people wherever they go. And you can trust us, we'll even take photos. Secondly, we would like to thank our host, Honorable former DG, the CEO of Standard Bank South Africa, and the team that led it. What we would like to find out, though, is how you managed to force the minister to wear your corporate colors for this event. That's thank you so much for your hospitality. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you so much for opening up this facility, not only for this event, but for other events that are to come. Thank you for the immense sponsorship that you'll be channeling to UPSIP. And thank you once again also for agreeing to participate in what will be the most exciting edition of the CEO Roundtable, which is live every Monday on our YouTube channel. Would like to also thank at this particular point in time our distinguished speakers. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Kaz. Thank you, Uzi, for making time to be with us today and share your insights and thoughts on this very topical matter. I am disappointed, though, that it was grey listing and I'm the only one who got the memo and wore a grey suit. To our associate organizations that remain friends of ours, APASA, we recognize you, Madam President, CFA, Deputy President, SAFCA, we recognize you, Chair and CEO. This country's got a lot of presidents, but anyway, thank you so much for making time on a Friday evening to join us. Leaders of business here present, we acknowledge you. Members of UPSIP, NEC, its leadership and its team in the office, thank you so much for the tireless work that you do in what is a thankless job. And to the members of the media who are here present as well this evening, thank you so much. Just by way of guidance, as you write your articles for tomorrow, this could be the way you started. Langamatongo gave a wonderful vote of thanks at a magnificent event hosted by UPSIP. There will be dessert served outside, but before we do that, I would like to take this opportunity to extend gifts to our distinguished guests. It's not much. We had to comply with Directive 8 as you are all in financial services in some shape or form. May I also then kindly ask the minister to grace us on stage so that we may give him his gift as well.
And then says depending on them.
You know, it was free. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again to everyone here present. Thank you to those who are watching on our streaming platforms. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Dinner will now be served and dessert will be outside. It's a chocolate table station. Hi, Standard Bank. Thank you very much and good night.